The Ziggurat of Babylon. This podcast is a Bible study on Genesis 11. No knowledge of Accordance Bible software is necessary, or of Greek or Hebrew. The Tower of Babylon is one of the best-known Bible stories. But what's the truth behind the story? If we read it in its cultural context, how does that help us understand its message? In this podcast, we'll try to do just that. In addition, most of these study podcasts show how to find material rather than how to present it. This time, I thought you might enjoy seeing how such material could be presented in a live Bible study. All the photos and images come from resources in Accordance. I've just copied and pasted them into Keynote, tweaking them just a bit along the way. This podcast also includes an example of teaching from a live text, which I'd like to encourage as a way of exploring the text together with our audiences. The passage we're going to study today is at the very end of the first section of Genesis. Genesis 1 through 11, which E.A. Spicer calls the Primeval History, introduces the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It covers, and I'll just roughly identify the main chapters here, the creation of the heavens and earth, the story of Adam and Eve, the fall of mankind, Cain and Abel, the chosen line, Seth, the flood, the Table of Nations, the Tower of Babel, and all of this is background for the story of Abraham in Genesis 12, the patriarch of Israel. Our story, the Tower of Babel, lies at the very tip of this first literary unit. Genesis 1 through 11 is very different from the rest of Genesis, both in language and genre. In language, it is filled with Mesopotamian imagery and loanwords, both of which are very different from the rest of the Pentateuch. Accordingly, many scholars believe that it dates from one of the two periods when Israel had the closest contact with the region. Abraham, who came from Ur sometime around the 2nd millennium BC, or the Judeans who were exiled to Babylon in the 6th century BC. Both are many miles and many centuries away from Moses, who was raised in Egypt and lived in the middle of the 2nd millennium, and who is credited with the authorship of the rest of the Pentateuch. Genesis 1 through 11 would have been prepended as an introduction to the patriarchal stories. For those of you who might be disturbed by this conclusion, let me point out that no one in Scripture actually ever attributes anything in Genesis 1 to 11 to Moses. As far as literary genre, Genesis 1 through 11 is widely recognized as belonging to the category myth. I realize this is an uncomfortable term for many, but this is a literary designation and has nothing to do with whether the events described are true or false, historical or fictional. Unfortunately, in our modern, Western, historical and scientific world, we've often come to equate myth with falsehood. Genesis 1's closest literary parallel, for instance, is Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. See podcast number 99 on Genesis 1. Myth has very specific characteristics. Here are the most prominent ones. Abstraction, making references more universal. Heightened imagery and polar opposites. Puns and word plays, both of which serve as mnemonic devices. Irony, sometimes bordering on sarcasm. Quid pro quo punishment. Myth is also generally an apologetic, especially against an opposing worldview, as myth orders and explains existence. The Tower of Babel not only deserves to be read in its literary context, but also in its cultural context. Many ancient peoples were convinced that mountains were especially sacred places. The mountains were often green long after lower regions turned brown. This photo shows the reason. The storm clouds released rain upon hills, making them suitable green pastures for flocks. Mountains were also excellent refuges, and very defensible, as it's easier to roll rocks down than throw them up, or rain arrows down upon an enemy, rather than trying to shoot uphill. Thus, people often associated their gods with the mountains, and used these high places to worship. Remember, even as the psalmist says, "I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where will my help come?" But what about places in the Near East where there were no mountains, like Egypt and Babylon? There, people often built artificial mountains. Thus we have the pyramids of Egypt, which also served as funerary monuments to immortalize the pharaohs, and the ziggurats of Sumer, Ashur, and Babylon, which are unfortunately less well preserved. Let me try and fill in the rest of the ruins of this particular ziggurat, which is located in the same city where Abraham was born. Maybe it would be better if I just used this professional illustration from Holman. Unlike the pyramids of Egypt, ziggurats had no interior, nor any funerary function. They were simply hollow brick structures which were then backfilled with dirt or sand before being capped. The cap, or cupola at the very top, is the Babel, or Gate of God, the place where the god was thought to appear to be with his people. And speaking of people, this structure wasn't in the middle of a desert as pictured here, but in the midst of a very, very large city, one of the greatest metropolises of the ancient world. These great monuments were emblazoned with the names and emblems of the builder, so that everyone who saw them would remember the builders for generations to come, giving them something like immortality, or so they thought. Speaking of bricks, the builders in both Egypt and Mesopotamia often used bricks rather than stone. Those of you familiar with the story of the Israelites in Egypt probably remember the story of the sun-baked bricks. Here's a photo of a brick mold, used for just those kinds of bricks. Mud and straw, which bound the sediment together, were pressed into the mold, then the brick was left out in the sun to dry, though they could also be fired in a kiln. Here's a mud and straw brick, which incidentally is stamped with a cartouche of Ramses II. Seemed he wanted to be really sure the gods remembered he was the one who built this structure. Here's its Babylonian equivalent, a brick from the palace of Sargon II. The cuneiform inscription reads, Palace of Sargon, King of the World, King of Assyria, Viceroy of Babylon, King of Sumer and Akkad, Builder of the city, Der Shuriken. Just imagine having a palace where every single brick is inscribed with your name. No one would ever forget you. Under the right conditions, structures built from bricks could last a very long time. This Canaanite gate in Ashkelon, dated to around 1850 BC, is one of the oldest arched gates in the entire world. It was built entirely from mud bricks, and its height and depth demonstrate just how many thousands of bricks it took to erect these sorts of monumental structures. Let's work through the story of the Tower of Babel paragraph by paragraph. Genesis 11:1 begins, Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, and they settled there. Now, if we take a look at some of these phrases, we'll know that they are obvious exaggerations and hyperbole. I'll just hit that with the yellow highlight. Whole world, one language, and also a common speech. That's one of the characteristics of myth, using those polar opposites and heightening the tension between them. The other thing here, the only one worthy of comment, is this whole idea of a plain in Shinar. In fact, there is a plain, and it's a rather large one, as you remember from the map. There's a chance here that this word plain is supposed to be somewhat condescending, because of course Abraham and his descendants, many of them were shepherds, and enjoyed the hills, which always provided adequate pasture for their flocks. Let's move to the next paragraph, which begins in verse 3. They said to each other, Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone, and tar for mortar. Then they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. And we'll do the same thing again. First of all, there's some heavy irony here, that they used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Of course, these are inferior building materials if you happen to be used to working with stone. That sarcasm is underscored here by the let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. Do you see the word bake right here? Let me go ahead and highlight that within a different color, maybe a blue here, and thoroughly. This is actually the word saraf repeated twice in Hebrew. It's by way of emphasis, and it's not the normal word for bake. It really means burn. So let us burn them crispy or something like that would carry a sense of the sarcasm that's happening here. Of course, baking bricks makes them much more durable, but in addition to that, fire is one of the things that destroys buildings. So we've got some tongue-in-cheek sort of things going on here. Now, let's get to the purpose clause. Of course, what they want to do is to build themselves a city, and I'm going to use a red highlight for that. That city is going to have, whoops, it jumped just a bit there. That city is going to have a tower that reaches to the heavens. That, of course, is the Tower of Babel that gives this story its name. And there are two things that they understand are going to flow from that. First of all, that building project is going to give them a name for themselves. That's the positive outcome. And the second is it's going to help them avoid a negative outcome, because otherwise they're going to be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Up to this point, the story has been a pretty godless one. God isn't even mentioned, let alone consulted. But here, beginning in verse 5, God enters the story, and the jokes get even more intense. First of all, even though they are about to build a tower that goes to the heavens, the fact is God has to come down to see it. Well, let's read the rest of the paragraph. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other. Now, I've already highlighted the first come down. Notice that is repeated just in case we didn't get it the first time. The fact is that human works, no matter how monumental they seem, are very, very small in God's eyes. He has to come down to see them. Notice also that the same sort of heightened language continues. We have one people speaking the same language. That's achad language, the same language. And nothing that they plan to do is going to be impossible for them. So we have these sort of overstatements so that we can sort of see the tension that is going on here. So God's solution is to confuse their language so that they won't understand each other in order to stop the building project. Now notice this word confuse, and you can see it down here in the instant details box. The word is balal. Now what's happening is we're going to get an alternate etymology of what this word actually means. Now, I'm going to go ahead and highlight that with a blue underline. There we go. And I also want to scroll back because there was something that we missed in the paragraph beforehand that I wanted to be sure and cover. And that's a quote from Gordon Wenham. He says, the builder's words are complete with ironic hints of the ultimate failure of their project. As already noted, the Hebrew words for make brick, for stone, and build for ourselves contain the consonants, and here let me just give the English equivalents, N, B, and L, which spell mix up, verse 7, or Babel in verse 9, and evoke the word folly, Nebelah. So there are jokes going on here in Hebrew that we can't even pick up unless we're going to be reading this like a native. So the consequence, they're not going to understand each other. One of the things about being a huge metropolis like Babylon is the fact that it's going to become a center of trade and commerce. Of course there are going to be people from all over, and of course they're going to speak a variety of languages. It's going to sound like a cacophony. So the story goes on, the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth. Now notice, this is the antithesis of what the builders had wanted. Also, you've got that all over the earth. Again, we've got that heightened language here. And that, of course, stops them from building the city. And now we've got the sort of crux of the story. We have here an alternate etymology of the word Babel. This city with its great tower was not going to be a gate of God. In fact, it's Balal. It's the place where God confused the language of the whole earth, And of course, it's the place of equally confused people. It's no wonder Abraham left Mesopotamia. And to close that paragraph, we have that concept repeated that, of course, God has scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Speaking of Abraham, let's skip this account of Shem's family line and go to the beginning of the very next chapter. Notice the contrast here in Genesis 12:1. The Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household," in other words, leave this land we just talked about, "to the land that I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great." Notice the contrast. God appears at the beginning of the story. He picks the person. He issues the commandments. He is the one who decides who becomes a great nation, and he is the one who makes an individual's name great. So what does the story of Babylon teach us when we read it in its cultural context? Well, it really needs to be read in the light of Genesis 12 and the story of Abraham, which follows. The grandiose tower and city were never completed. The Ziggurat's top never reached the heavens. God had to come down to earth to see it. A human-built artificial mountain can never compete with God's created mountains. And God doesn't need a gate to talk with his people. He chooses the time and place. Those who sought to make a name for themselves wound up with none. Their legacy monumental building was never finished. Their actual names were lost in the confusion of multiple languages. Their real names don't even appear in this story. Those who try to make a name for themselves are doomed. It's God who makes an individual's name great. Finally, those who tried to unite all humans under their rule scattered them instead. The building did not become a rallying place, but a point of division. Their empire fell apart because they no longer shared a common language. People scattered to places where there were others who shared their language instead, and God, not humans, decides which people and nations will be great. I trust you've enjoyed this exposition of the Tower of Babel in its literary and cultural context. The author of Genesis 1 through 11, in molding this story into myth, has also profoundly transformed its meaning. It's no longer just a historical example of a failed building project, but a lasting warning for those who try to usurp God's role in guiding human destiny. This has been Dr. J for Accordance Bible Software. Thank you for watching this episode of Lighting the Lamp.